to have you, Niels.
Thanks very much. Can I start?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. So I'm super happy to present here. Thanks very much for setting this up or for attending to this joint work with Jørgen Johannesen in Oslo and Bob Rikers at the World Bank. So there's a lot of debate about what we call aid effectiveness, so the ability of foreign aid to foster economic development. And so roughly you could say there are two camps. There's like a pro-aid camp where Jeffrey Sachs belongs, and then there's like a more aid skeptic camp where William Easterly and others belong. And so one important concern, especially for the skeptics, of course, is that aid may not always be used for the intended purposes, and particularly aid may be diverted by corrupt elites. And so there are a couple of reasons to take this concern seriously. So one is that this is consistent with theories of rent seeking in the presence of aid. Another one is that it's consistent with the pattern that a lot of aid is paid to countries with a lot of corruption and poor governance. And a third reason is that there's just a lot of anecdotal evidence out there on failed development projects and also about self-interested elites. So although there are good reasons to take this challenge very seriously, there's very little empirical work out there. And so, of course, one reason to why there's not so much work is just that it's really hard to do this empirically. Just that it's hard to study all the issues related to crime and corruption and tax evasion, because people that are doing what the people who are studying are really trying to hide what they're studying. So the starting point for this paper is that we might learn something about aid diversion by looking at money flows to offshore banking centers. So why do we think that? Well, first of all, we know that accounts in offshore financial centers belong to wealthy elites. So if we see money flowing to these accounts around the time where countries receive big aid disbursements, it is at least suggestive that this is not money belonging to the poorest segments of society, but to the wealthy. Also, the most salient characteristic of these offshore financial centers is that they have institutions facilitating secrecy and asset protection, meaning that this is exactly where you expect corrupt officials to send their money if they had captured aid. And also, we just have a lot of case studies, a lot of anecdotal evidence showing that money laundering by corrupt elites often happen through offshore financial centers. So the paper is going to proceed in three steps. So first, we're going to try to estimate the causal effect of aid on wealth in these offshore centers. And then in the next step, we're going to try to understand what it means. We're going to investigate whether it plausibly reflects aid diversion or some other alternative mechanism that you could think about. And then finally, we draw implications for the magnitude of aid diversion. And so the ultimate parameter we are after is an implied leakage rate. So for each dollar of aid dispersed, how much shows up on offshore accounts. Just to give you a preview of the results, I think in the first part of the paper, we can pretty robustly and convincingly show that aid disbursements do cause an increase in deposits held in offshore banking centers. So we see a very sharp increase in deposits right in the quarter where aid is dispersed. We see no increase in pre-disbursement quarters, so it's not that this is just a differential pre-existing trend. So this finding is robust to excluding observation with confounding events. You could imagine, that there would be stuff like wars and crises that would at the same time, pull aid in and push money out. But even when we exclude all these events, we still find the same result. Our results are even robust to country year fixed effect, where we are only identifying the timing of these aid disbursements within a country across quarters of the year. And it's also robust to instrumenting aid to actually, so using information about the size of aid commitments, pre-existing aid commitments and typical disbursement schemes as an instrument for actual aid disbursements. So pretty like robust result that aid disbursements do cause an increase in deposits on offshore accounts. So it's a little more tricky to understand, what this means, but at least I think it's fair to say that diversion of aid disbursements by elites is a plausible mechanism. So why do I think that? Well, first, while we see that aid disbursements are associated with an increase in deposits in what we call havens, these places with secrecy and asset protection, we see no change in other major banking centers. So like we see money flowing to Zurich and Luxembourg, but not money flowing to New York and Frankfurt and Paris at the time of these aid disbursements. When we split the sample of aid receiving countries by corruption, we see larger effects in more corrupt countries. When we split aid flows by the final exposed assessment of the project, we see that the projects that ultimately fail or perform poorly, that they are associated, like aid for these projects are associated with larger increases in haven deposits. And finally, we also see similar patterns when we look, instead of offshore deposits, when we look at like incorporations of offshore shell companies that are often used to hide wealth. So these were just like reasons to think that this could be related to aid diversion. When we compute the leakage rate, we find numbers around, between 5 and 10%, you could say. Like, so our headline number is 7.5%. And of course, like this, you should probably think of this as a lower bound, because I mean, it only includes money that shows up on accounts in havens in the quarter where aid is dispersed. So it doesn't include, like other uses, you could say, of captured funds, like just consumption or investment in real estate or other things. And also, like, it only includes, so you could say, flows to accounts offshore that are held directly by controlled directly by people in the aid receiving country. So it doesn't include diversion through offshore intermediaries. And our result on these offshore shell corporations suggests that they might also actually go on additional leakage through these intermediaries. Anyway, it's fair to acknowledge already now that that we cannot completely nail this, just because we're working with macro data, and we simply do not know like who in a country transfers money to these havens around aid disbursements. So there are a number of other mechanisms that you could think about, and I would say like the most plausible alternative mechanism is that you have local contractors who receive funds at the time that aid is dispersed and send then the money to havens. And that could have to do with, just that you operating in very poor countries. So where like the financial sector is not very functional. So you might, use foreign banks for cash management. You might be worried that the government will actually expropriate your profits if you don't take them offshore, or it could have to do with tax avoidance. So these are reasons why a priori, like a local contract hypothesis could also explain, some of these funds going offshore around aid disbursements, and we're gonna try to basically try to distinguish like these two hypotheses, so the elite capture versus local contractors in one part of the paper. So other mechanisms that you might think about that I think we can more confidently rule out is, could this have to do with portfolio adjustments by banks? You have money flowing in from the World Bank. Could banks like put money offshore, like somehow, like due to this inflow? So we can rule that out, just because we can separate out deposits that are owned by non-banks. So we can basically throw away everything that has to do with the interbank market and only look at deposits owned by non-banks. We can also rule out tax avoidance by multinational firms, just for the reason that if you would transfer profits to a haven subsidiary, well, then the deposits would then, in the statistics that we are working with, they would be assigned to that haven where the subsidiary is incorporated, so they would no longer belong to these aid receiving countries. And finally, you could think that, well, this might be about aid just creating growth, and then everybody's incomes is growing, and then people will evade taxes and putting money on haven accounts, well, but just like the timing here doesn't seem right. So stimulus doesn't work like overnight or within a quarter. We see like this very sharp increase in haven deposits right at the time where disbursements are paid out, and no subsequent, increases in offshore wealth.
Niels, I had a question, which was, do we have a sense of this, which fraction of firms versus individuals hold offshore accounts in these tax havens? And if so, would that help to address this, this alternative mechanism of local contractors?
Great question. So our data doesn't provide a breakdown of deposits owned by non-banks on firms and households, and often like it is a blurry line because like it might really be private individuals who are using an offshore shell corporation to hold their offshore assets. So no, we don't have good data on that.
Thanks.
Okay, so let me get a bit more into the detail here. So our main data source on what is going on offshore is the BIS locational banking statistics, which basically has information about cross-border deposits for all major banking centers in the world. So for example, in here you'll see all deposits in Swiss banks belonging to non-bank residents of Zambia. So you get like this bilateral cross-border deposit information. So there's one important caveat that I mentioned already, that the BIS uses immediate ownership to allocate deposits to different countries. So if, for example, you would imagine like a Zambian individual who would own a Swiss deposit account, but would own it through a Cayman corporation, well, then the BIS would assign that deposit account to the Caymans, and it wouldn't appear in our data on Zambian controlled foreign deposits. So another way to put this is that we don't observe like deposits held through offshore intermediaries. So with that caveat, so our key outcome here is deposits in havens owned by residents of country I, in this case Zambia, at the end of quarter T, and this then adds like deposits in all the countries, all the banking centers that we classify as havens. So just to give you a sense of like what countries that is, here I've listed like the top 25 international banking centers by the size of the foreign controlled deposits in their banking sector. And the blue bars here are considered non-havens, and the red bars is what we consider havens. And you can see that like although the biggest banking centers of the world are the UK and the US, you have many havens among like really like the top banking centers in the world. For example, the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Belgium, Singapore, Hong Kong, and so on. And so what is the criteria that we use here to categorize banking centers as haven versus non-havens? Well, this is largely based on a 2009 report by the OECD, where they say like which banking centers in the world employ the global transparency principle. So which banking centers allow for information exchange with foreign countries, and which countries just refuse to do that with reference to, for example, banking secrecy. And so, yeah, and this is a list that emerged around 2010, which is at the end of our sample period. So although many things have happened in the field since 2010, this is like a good time for that list for our purposes here. So that was like the offshore deposit part. So the other key element here is data on aid disbursements, and here we rely on data from what is called the World Bank Project Database, which covers all disbursements made by the World Bank. So we are only, like in this paper, we are only studying aid disbursements made by the World Bank. The advantages of doing that is at least twofold. So first we have a high frequency, so we observe aid disbursements at the quarterly. I mean, so basically, as often as we want, we can do it at the quarter level, which matches then the deposit information. And the second advantage is that we observe a lot of information about these disbursements at the project level. So we observe, for example, at what time the commitment was made for a particular project, and also the amount that was committed. We observed the date of all disbursements made, and we observed like some general project information about like what kind of aid instrument was it, what kind of industry receives the aid, and also importantly information about this ex-post evaluation of the project outcome. So this will be useful for different purposes later on. And but just for the purposes of our main analysis, we are going to construct this key aid variable, which is just like the disbursements made from the World Bank to country I in quarter T, and we call that variable aid. The last major kind of data source here is data on offshore corporations, and here we're going to rely on the data leaks that have been published by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And they're basically leaks that tell us something about incorporations of these offshore intermediaries, so like offshore shell companies typically. And so there are several leaks. Like the most famous one is probably the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers, but there are more of them, and they cover so 4 different corporate service providers based in places like the British Virgin Islands and Panama and Bermuda. So most famously Mossack Fonseca in Panama, and there are also leaks from 8 actually kind of corporate registers in a number of havens. So what do we see in these leaks? So we have like a long list of these corporations. We see when they're incorporated, and sometimes also when they are struck off, so when they are closed. We observe information about what they call corporate officers. They can be shareholders, directors, beneficiaries. So the people that are ultimately controlling the corporations. And then, like, what is the major limitation here is that we see nothing on assets or activities. So clearly, so we can never use this to start to estimate leakage, because we just don't know how much money is flowing through these intermediaries, and we are not able to distinguish, like offshore corporations that actually serve a legitimate business purpose and those that are just used as a front or as a holding company. In any case, our outcome that we construct based on this data set is just a simple variable that gives you the number of offshore corporations with links to a country I in quarter T, or like with controlled by people in country I in quarter T, and call this variable corporations.
Niels, I was just curious, are you able to use the corporate officers data to match to government officials directly?
I think, so in principle, yes, and this is what the journalists have done, right? So they've parsed through all these many terabytes of information and kind of looked for names that match, like influential people and so on. I think it's really a task for journalists more than for. You couldn't do this on a systematic large scale. I think also because it doesn't have to be the name of the president. It could be like the name of his lawyer or someone he trusts, like a brother, or so it's complicated. But in principle, yes.
Makes sense.
Thank you. Okay, so finally about the estimation sample. So we're gonna study mainly like 22. The 22 most aid-dependent countries in our data set. So these are countries that receive more than 2% of their GDP in World Bank disbursements in an average year. We're going to focus on the time period 1990 to 2010 for the reason that like we are relying, like our deposit data set is not, like our main data set is not publicly available. So we're relying on a restricted data set that only runs until 2010. But we do make an extension with publicly available deposit data that runs all the way until 2018. So this is not quite the same quality, and it doesn't include as many havens, but still we find similar results when we extend the period to 2018 using public data. And finally, when we study these offshore incorporations, we can also cover a longer time period. Okay, so let me talk a bit about the empirical strategy here. So our model, our baseline model looks like this. So on the left-hand side, we have the D-log of haven deposits owned by country I in period T. So you can think of this as just like so the quarterly growth rate of the deposits that a given country holds in havens. On the right-hand side, we have like a measure of aid, so the dispersions by the World Bank to that country in that quarter, and it is scaled by GDP. And then we have a number of controls. We have a vector of controls, like which always includes GDP growth. So that's what is in X. Could be other things too. And then we have country fixed effects, just to account for like differences in the general trends in offshore wealth accumulation, and time fixed effects. And so you could think of like what does this equation then capture? Well, it basically asks whether haven deposits, whether they grow at a higher rate in quarters where you have larger aid disbursements conditional on all these controls. Or more precisely, beta here will express the percentage growth in haven deposits associated with an aid disbursement equivalent to 1% of GDP. And so one thing that you'll probably note here is that the beta now is not going to be the ultimate coefficient of interest. We're talking about the leakage rate, so this is not going to be the leakage rate, and we'll rely on a rewriting of the beta to get to the leakage rate later. So the reason why we do not set up our regression in a way that we can estimate the leakage rate directly is something we might want to discuss in the question and answer session afterwards. But the basic intuition is that you need some kind of log transformation of your haven deposits to really capture all the residual noise that there is in the equation. So one challenge here is, of course, that aid flows are not necessarily endogenous or exogenous, so they might be endogenous to many factors that also affect cross-border capital flows. So we already mentioned, you can think of wars, for example. They may at the same time cause the World Bank to pay more aid to the country, and also at the same time induce households to send their money abroad. So how do we deal with that? Well, we have different strategies. So first is that we compare deposits in havens to deposits in non-havens. And the thinking is that, while non-havens are probably less attractive for laundering the proceeds from corruption, they might also be affected by many of the same confounding factors as haven deposits. So it's a useful comparison to make. We also augment the model with leads and lags, just to see if there is a pre-existing trend that explains this higher growth in the disbursement quarter. As we exclude periods with many confounding events, including wars and coups and natural disasters and financial crisis and all of this at once. And then finally, we instrument disbursements with predicted, you could say, disbursements given the commitments that are in place and given the usual disbursement schedule across many projects. So let me get to the results. So here's a table that summarizes the main result, and you can see that there's a significant increase in haven deposits of around 3.4% for each. The disbursement of aid equivalent to 1% of GDP. There's no similar increase in deposits in non-havens, and if we use you can say the differential increase in haven deposits, meaning the increase in haven deposits over and above the increase in non-haven deposits, we get a coefficient of around 5.0%. Yes. So this is the results from a dynamic specification where we include 4 leads and 4 lags of the disbursement variable, and it's clearly there's no pre-trend, there's no differential changes in haven deposits in the quarters before the disbursement, and also almost nothing after. So the definition is, of course, that what happens around this aid disbursement is that you have a level shift up in haven deposits, and and then like no, I mean then you're back to the same trend as countries that do not receive a disbursement.
Niels, can I ask you a question? This is Hano.
Absolutely.
So about the specification, would it make sense to look at delta log haven divided by GDP? That is to say, sort of control for on the left-hand side for changes in local, well, not control, but just scale by local GDP. What I have in mind is that if there's sort of, if mechanically aid disbursement just sort of stimulates economic activity, and that always goes together with some increase in transfers to these banking havens. It'd be interesting to see if your result survives when you sort of scale by local GDP on the left-hand side, right?
So you wanna estimate this equation as it's written here, but just divide it by GDP.
Yeah, divide haven by GDP in some sense.
Yeah, so we've done that. So if you just do delta haven over GDP, then because aid is also scaled by GDP, then beta gets the interpretation of the leakage rate, because then it's really going to be like the increase in haven deposits by dollar of aid dispersed. And we do that in the paper just as another way of getting at the leakage rate. And what we find is like a coefficient that is consistent with our baseline estimate of the leakage rate of around 7-8%, but it's insignificant.
But I was actually asking. Sorry, maybe I was actually asking slightly different question. What if you in the brackets? So you still take logs, but you divide by GDP.
Okay, I get it. Okay. We have not done that. We've not done that. So you're saying
anyway, just something to think about. Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. Okay. Thanks. Okay. So this was the result for haven deposits, like a clear level shift in the disbursement quarter, and then nothing. If you do the same thing for deposits in non-havens, such as like the US or the UK or Germany or France, you get this picture. So there's no systematic change around the aid disbursements. And if you do the differential in haven deposits over and above the non-haven deposits, you get this picture here. So again, like a very salient kind of spike is precisely in the disbursement quarter. Here's a first table showing you some robustness results. I'll not dwell a long time on those, but here's the baseline result of around 3.4% increase in haven deposits per €1 1% of GDP aid disbursement. When you exclude war periods, when you exclude periods with coups, natural disasters, financial crisis, or all of those at the same time, you still get pretty similar coefficients, and they remain statistically significant. If you introduce country year fixed effect, so you're only living off the timing of these disbursements within the year for a given country, you also get a similar coefficient and retain significance, at least at the 10% level. As for the IV strategy, so we have not invented this ourselves. We are taking that from Art Cray. He has 2 papers using that, and the idea is that that there is at least one. I mean, while aid generally might respond to local conditions, including the conditions that is pushing out capital to foreign havens, there's at least one component of aid that's exogenous in the sense that it's determined by prior commitments, and is therefore exogenous to whatever current shocks that you are living, and therefore this component might serve as an instrument. So there's precise steps that we are conducting here that we are predicting for each project. We are predicting a quarterly disbursements in the post commitment period using the value of the initial commitment and a typical disbursement schedule for other projects in the same region of the world and the same industry. And so when we have predicted these disbursements dynamically for each project, well, then we just aggregate predicted disbursements across projects for a given country quarter to get the estimate. So that will be predicted aid disbursements for country I at time T. And then, of course, you want some kind of a time lag because you don't want to include in your instrument, for example, disbursements made exactly in the commitment quarter, because then you have not really gained anything. So we always exclude the initial kind of commitment quarter, and we also do robustness checks where we are excluding more quarters. So basically, our instrument only builds on disbursement that happened, like 2 or 3 or 4 quarters after the commitment. So when we implement this strategy, we just to compare with the OLS baseline of 3.4, when we exclude just the commitment quarter, we get a coefficient of 3.2. When we exclude more quarters, we get like a slightly more noisy first stage, but the coefficient grows a little bit, but we retain also significance. Okay, so just to be clear again, so I think that this amounts to pretty strong evidence that something happens with these haven deposits, and specifically with the haven deposits in the quarters where aid is paid out. So, but again, like the basic limitation is that we need to dig a bit more to investigate like what is the most plausible mechanism here. And of course, like the basic limitation is that it's macro data. We don't observe like who owns these accounts to which money is shifted around aid disbursements. So there'll always be some uncertainty about what is actually going on.
Niels, there's a question from the audience from Jadip
Sure.
Oberoi, who was asking whether it's possible to find data on the timing of the awarding of contracts for the aid-funded projects, and if that would perhaps help to understand the timing of, I guess, what's being captured versus what could potentially be going to legitimate projects.
That's a great question that I'm not able to answer. So I've not, I mean, you think that it exists somewhere in some World Bank database that they know at what time they make these contracts. But then again, I mean, what would you expect? So say that the World Bank enters into, or so the contractor wins a bid in some quarter. Would you expect something to happen in that quarter? Or would you expect things to happen when the money is dispersed? So I'm not completely sure, like how we use data if we happen.
Yeah, I think my understanding of the question, and Jaideep, feel free to jump in if I've misunderstood, was that perhaps there might be a lag between when the aid is dispersed to the country and then when the country would then use the aid for would hire a contractor for whatever the project actually was, and that might help to
yes. Okay.
Think
so
about the timing.
Yeah, I get it. Good point. I think it might depend on the type of aid instrument and I mean, so I think that it's a good point. I think I need to look into like whether the data can be dug out. But I see the point.
Thanks. This is Jaideep. I mean, in a way, the IV is actually kind of addressing that question to quite an extent, but still, I guess I mean, there's a little bit more you could think about in terms of, because when the contract is awarded, it could be long before the actual money is dispersed, but that's actually when a lot of money changes hands potentially. Yeah. So that might be something to, even there could be like both lags and I mean in both directions really. So the drive could take place beforehand as well. So.
Yeah, it's a great suggestion. I'll definitely look into like whether this data could be dug out and what could potentially be learned. So thanks very much. Yeah, so where were we? So mechanism. So we just argue that these results that we showed you are consistent, at least with aid capture. I mean, for different reasons. So one, of course, that money flows to havens, like with bank secrecy and different forms of asset protection, and not to non-havens, which is exactly what you suggest under this elite capture hypothesis. And also, like the sharpness of the response really suggests that funds might not even really enter the real economy before they're diverted to these offshore accounts. So you could really think still of this a competing hypothesis of local contractors. It's important to stress here that, I mean, so if you have foreign contractors that would receive money under these contracts, this would not really be an explanation for our results. Why? Well, because the deposits belonging to these foreign contractors will be assigned to that foreign country in the BRS statistics. So kind of our measurement like really excludes whatever offshore account that the foreign contractors hold. So what we really what really is the competing hypothesis is like a local domestic firms receiving payments under these state-sponsored contracts and depositing the funds in offshore banking centers. And you could think, I mean, so I think it's a bit of a puzzle still under this hypothesis of why would money then only flow to havens? So you think that there would need to also be some element of secrecy, which could, reflect either some element of embezzlement or just that you are afraid of expropriation or tax avoidance or something else. So our key strategy to address this question of mechanisms is to, and let me just skip, we already talked about this, let me just skip this, is to look at heterogeneity in these effects. So I'll start looking at studying heterogeneity by country characteristics. Basically, we're splitting our sample of 22 countries here on some characteristic and then estimating the effect of aid on haven deposits for these two groups of countries separately, but in the same regression. And so I'm plotting the coefficients here without confidence intervals, and this is just also to be open and say that, I mean, the differences here are almost never statistically significant. They're often kind of economically meaningful, but not statistically different. What we find is that that the effect of disbursements on haven deposits seem to be bigger in countries with more corruption. That's the lower set of bars. It is bigger for countries that have some kind of disclosure rules under which politicians and government officials are required to disclose their assets, which we also think is consistent with the idea that if you gain from these contracts, you need to be more careful about hiding the money away on offshore accounts. We find larger effects on countries that have poor institutions measured with the polity score. And we think of all of these three like bottom splits here, they really are consistent with this elite hypothesis mechanism. The last comparison here shows that there are also larger effects in countries that has a weak local financial sector, which you could say that really supports like the local contractor hypothesis, because like this is exactly the environment where local firms might be more inclined to just shift their profits to foreign bank accounts just because the local banks are not good. We also study heterogeneity by project characteristics. So this is basically within each, so we assign each aid disbursement to different kind of projects and then accumulate them so we get like eight variables in each regression. And I think the key one, the most interesting one, is the top one here, showing that you have larger responses in terms of increases in haven deposits when the disbursement goes to a project that is ultimately unsuccessful, that has an unsatisfactory outcome according to the World Bank's own exposed evaluation. And I think this is clearly consistent with diversion, and it also speaks to this idea that this actually like really matters, right, for aid effectiveness. That if you take money away from a project, then it's going to ultimately perform more poorly. Another important split here is by the share of domestic procurement in the project. So and what it shows is that when you have a low share of domestic procurement, you get more flows to tax havens for a given aid disbursement, which is really speaking directly against this local contractor hypothesis, because like why would you have bigger responses when you have fewer local contractors, basically. And finally, there's a split by what is called the aid instrument. So that could be either like a disbursement supporting a particular government policy or a disbursement supporting a particular project. And we see that there's more, there's a bigger effect on haven deposits on these IPF, these investment projects disbursements. So yeah, this is just summing up. Maybe in the interest of time, I shouldn't spend so much time on that. So we already talked about these things since the beginning of the talk. But I mean, so there are two competing hypotheses. Like elite capture is certainly consistent with a lot of what we are finding, whereas this local contractor hypothesis is, clearly consistent with, bigger effects in less developed credit markets, but really like strongly inconsistent with larger estimates when we have fewer local contractors. So just to talk a little bit about the leakage. So the way that we get the leakage rate is that we are saying, well, our baseline estimate is this, that for each aid disbursement equivalent to 1% of GDP, we get haven deposits increasing by 3.4%. At the sample mean, countries have haven deposits equivalent to 2.2% of GDP. So basically this number here corresponds to 0.075% of GDP. That's just the two numbers multiplied. And that means that we get like a leakage rate of 7.5%. And the way to think about this is this is what the results imply for the average country. If you were the donor, if you were the World Bank, you might be more interested in getting a leakage rate for the average dollar that you are paying out. And so if we instead, if we do the same exercise, but weighing the countries by their share of World Bank aid, we get a somewhat lower leakage rate of 5%. We also, in the paper that we are preparing a revision now, and we have so incorporate like a more direct approach to estimating these leakage rates. And this is basically just in the main model here, we are replacing this term by just a change in haven deposits over GDP. So since both aid and the change in haven deposits are scaled by GDP, the beta will just express the leakage rate directly. And we get like very similar leakage rate when we do that, but they're insignificant, suggesting that when you don't have like a log transformation of these deposits, you just get a lot of noise that blows up the standard errors. I think I have 5 minutes left. Is that right, Jency?
Yes, and then we'll have more time for Q&A after.
Yeah. Okay, so then, yeah. So what is these leakage rates? What do they mean? Well, so how should we think about them? So of course there are reasons. I mean, there will be reasons to think that we are in fact overestimating capture here, and this could be, for example, if the local contractors actually contribute to some of this increase in haven deposits in the disbursement quarter. It could also be if, given that we only have so World Bank aid in the denominator of our leakage rate here, you could think that, if World Bank aid correlates with aid from other sources, you could think that we are overestimating the leakage rate. Personally, I think it's probably more likely that we are underestimating the leakage rate for the following reasons. So one is that we only include funds that are then subsequently shifted to offshore accounts, and not funds that are captured and invested in other assets or spent. And also, of course, as I mentioned early on, so another reason why we underestimate capture is that we don't capture with our method here. We don't capture funds that are diverted through these offshore intermediaries. And so this is a good starting point for the final, analytical part of the paper, where we say, well, can we say something about, or does it look in the data like there is some diversion going on through these offshore intermediaries that we don't capture in our main analysis? And so we're using this leaked data here. I already talked about the data. So, but the idea here is to construct a number of offshore corporations controlled by a given country in a given quarter, and then apply the exact same model to that number instead of the deposits. So we're basically studying whether aid disbursements coincide with these offshore incorporations of shell companies. So here is one way to summarize the results. This is like the same kind of dynamic specification as I showed you earlier for Haven deposit. It shows that like in the disbursement quarter, you see like a spike in the number of corporations controlled by the country, which is suggesting, that there might be some diversion also through like newly incorporated offshore intermediaries. And I mean, so there's a bit more noise in the pre-period here, but there's no like indication of a clear like pre-system trend here. And that result is, I mean, at least robust to introducing country year fixed effects and to excluding all these confounding events. And the IV becomes noisy here, but the coefficient is still grows a little bit, but it's still positive. And this is when you do the same exercise, or like you can say like some main heterogeneity analysis here. Again, we find the same result, that this diversion through offshore intermediaries is bigger, or the effect on offshore intermediaries is bigger when you are in a high corruption country, and it's bigger when you have when you are talking about aid going into projects that are ultimately less successful in terms of meeting the objectives. I think this is a good time to stop. Time is out. So just let me just say, like, I think it's useful to think about this paper as doing two things. Like, so it produces this like very robust evidence that aid disbursements cause an increase in deposits held in offshore banking centers, and not in other kinds of banking centers. So more controversial, of course, like what does it mean? So again, diversion by leads is a plausible mechanism that fits with a lot of the patterns in the data, but ultimately we cannot rule out other mechanisms, for example, domestic contractors. And the implied leakage rate of this implied by these findings is around 7.5%. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Niels. So we have a few questions lined up. Jaideep had a follow-up question. Jaideep, if you want to unmute yourself and ask.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just curious whether you considered looking at a reversal of flows as well. So if you think about the fact that if there's sort of corruption, there's also potential for sort of round trip transfers, right? Money goes there, but then gets reinvested back into the country. And that might be different across the two types of countries, with better and worse institutions, or better and or less deep credit markets and financial markets. So I was just wondering if you looked at the other direction of flows as well.
Yeah, so we have not. So, but I mean, you might be thinking, Rob, about this Journal of Finance paper that studies, so what happens to FDI flows from havens into the US when the US changes its capital tax rate, and they find, patterns consistent with round tripping. So US investors will kind of invest into the US like through these offshore intermediaries. I guess you can imagine something similar here, and this is a super good idea. Except maybe that what would you invest in? Like, so what would you? I mean, so my thinking would be that if you might want to take money home for consumption at some point, but maybe, I mean, and maybe also to buy local assets, real estate, and so on. But maybe, I guess in these countries, it's hard to imagine that there is a whole lot of, I mean, a big equity market where you could really get a diversified portfolio of local equity investments. What is your thinking?
Yes, I was just thinking that if there is a market, and then you would expect a different type of flow. And if also if there's a tax avoidance objective, then you might expect a different type of flow. So you might be able to distinguish a little bit better. If someone is just hiding money, then you wouldn't have that flow. No,
so I mean, so I guess the way I'm thinking about it is that, like the fact that we don't seem to see any reversal in 4 quarters after disbursement. It seems that it's really just a level shift up in these hidden deposits and then like nothing taken home. That is, like I think in itself less consistent with, just cash management, because if you're a firm, just using foreign accounts, you'd expect to see like this money also flowing back. Whereas like if you are a corrupt, official or politician, then maybe it makes sense, that you are just accumulating wealth during your term, and then like it's really for long-term consumption or savings, and then there's not necessarily any reversal like of flows going the other way in the short term.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. I mean, I was just thinking also that there were some anecdotal stories about what used to happen in China. A lot of investment used to come in from Hong Kong, but which was actually originally through China itself. So there are cases of that kind of thing happening. So I was just
totally.
It was just an idea.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
There's another question from the audience, Abraham, if you're ready to ask. Okay, I think you may be not there right now. Hanno, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, Niels, thanks for a great presentation. I had another question for you. So is it at all possible that banks and the non-haven countries are somehow less willing to offer banking services even to legitimate clients from some aid recipient countries because of concerns about compliance? I could imagine that maybe in some of these non-haven countries, because compliance is stricter, if you're from a certain set of these countries that are aid recipients, that some of these banks just wouldn't want to work with you, even if even for entirely legitimate purposes, you wanted to open a bank account or something like that.
It could be. I mean, so I guess like especially if you are, I mean, what's called a politically exposed person. So if you are a government official, then there's these anti-money laundering procedures that kick in and that are pretty cumbersome. And so you can imagine that will be, I mean, effectively be taken more seriously by a bank in the US or the UK than by a bank in a haven.
Yeah, right.
Good point.
It's something to think about. I mean,
yeah, but I mean, actually, so there is, I guess, some evidence pointing to the opposite. So there's a famous paper in literature by a guy called Jason Sharman, who has done like experimentally, he's kind of contacting different banks and also offshore incorporation service providers, and just saying, well, I would like to open this anonymous account. I'd like to do this and that. And he actually finds like that there's more compliance in some of the hardcore havens in the US and the UK. So it's not
okay.
I mean,
not clear. Yeah.
Yeah, but good point.
Okay. Thanks, Niels.
Great. And I think Zhengyan, did you also have a question?
Yep. So Niels, thanks. This is really intriguing work. I actually have 2 questions. And the first question is if you could separately identify spending shocks from governments, for example, and see if that also triggers flows to offshore tax havens. The reason I'm asking this question is because I want to tell if foreign aid is special. For example, if
yes. Great. I mean, so one thing that we do along these lines is that we do include, I hope it's in my first table, we do include GDP growth. I don't have it here. We do include GDP growth in our equation, and GDP growth is associated with more deposits in both havens and non-havens. Mm-hmm. So just the general income shock, like there doesn't seem to be any difference. But I think you're right that you could imagine that I mean, to study not diversion of aid, but just corruption more generally, like through or diversion of government funds more generally, like you could really, if you could find some exogenous variation in government spending, you could look at the effect of that on haven deposits. Is that what you had in mind?
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's a very good idea, actually.
Yeah. Actually, to build up on that, if I could take a darker view, could you also check if the foreign aid also triggers a flow from tax haven to the country from which the aid originates from? Like the potential story is that there's also a rebate to whoever approves such aid.
So we are only looking at aid from the World Bank, but so I guess if you had a data set with bilateral donors, you could do something like that, right?
Yes.
And the only problem like with this is that like this data like on aid disbursements from other donors than the World Bank, I don't think you can get it ever like at a higher frequency than annual, and you don't know anything about the projects. And so I think there's a lot of things that you cannot do with this kind of data that we can do with the World Bank data.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jinyang. Ibrahim, did you want to ask your question directly, or if not, I can ask it for you? Okay, so feel free to jump in, but the question that he asked was about comparing countries with the same level of corruption. So he wrote, I think comparing with some countries with almost the same level of corruption, but not receiving aid would have helped to clarify and capture leakage.
Yes, okay, so you'd want to compare like a corrupt country receiving aid to a equally corrupt country not receiving aid. So there'll be, yeah, okay, I get that as a kind of a placebo, I guess, comparison.
Yeah, yeah, I'm not sure if he's here to add to that. But yeah, I think in the same way that I was thinking that Jinyang's question was a bit like a placebo as well.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So I guess, are there any more questions from the audience? I guess one question I had was, there's now these data sets being put together of unofficial capital flows. This is work that Christoph Trevisch is doing, for instance. It's not super clear that those are development aid necessarily, but I think it does have a flavor of, they often come in some sort of treaty. And I was wondering if that would be something you guys would be looking at.
Wow, so what is that unofficial capital flows?
Yeah, so they're like they're unofficial flows in the sense of they're like government to government. Sorry, official flows. Sorry, government to government lending. I'm not. I think they vary with respect to exactly what the what they're earmarked for, but often, so for instance, a lot of the Belt and Road Initiative would come under those sorts of flows. And so, so my question was kind of, that would be one area to look at in addition to World Bank aid.
Totally. That sounds super interesting. Did you say, was it Christoph Trevisch who was?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I'll have a look at that.